Superhero franchises have taken over the film industry for the past 15 years, and for every Avengers Endgame or Spider-Man No Way Home, there are superhero movies that not only failed, but failed so bad future franchises were scrapped. The 2010s was the decade of cinematic universes and franchises, so in this video I want to go through some of the superhero movies and franchises that failed, movies that never got a sequel, or franchises that never got their ending. We'll talk about the quality of the movies, of course, but we'll mostly focus on what these movies were trying to set up and why they failed to start a franchise. I'd like to give a shout out to my friend the Thrifty Typewriter for inspiring this video with his 8 failed fantasy franchises and what happened to them video, so check out that video as well. It's now time to talk about the failed franchises, and let's begin with failed franchise number 1. Number 1, Green Lantern. 2011's Green Lantern is known for being one of the worst comic book movies ever made. If you've seen this movie, you might actually agree with that. The movie follows the standard origin story of Hal Jordan, aka the Green Lantern. Watching this movie almost 15 years later, it's clear that this movie was inspired by Iron Man in a lot of ways. Hal is kind of like Tony in the sense that he's this unlikable douchebag who eventually becomes the hero in the end and saves the day. There's a lot of problems with this movie, but the biggest one for me has to be the pacing of it. Hal doesn't have any serious wants or desires in this movie. He's almost never striving to actually do something. The movie begins and the ring magically chooses him. Hal doesn't do anything to deserve it. Then after he gets his powers and meets all the Lantern people, he spends most of the movie just experimenting with his powers. Characters should strive for something in a story, and Hal is nothing like that. The rest of the characters in this movie are seriously underdeveloped as well. There's just so many of them, it's hard to focus on any specific one. The funniest thing about this movie for me was actually the cast. I hadn't seen this movie in so long that I completely forgot most of the cast. I can't believe I forgot Blake Lively was in this movie. Funny enough, Reynolds and Lively actually met each other on the set of this movie, so it's funny to think that this abomination led to their marriage. Also, Taika Waititi's in this movie. He plays Hal's friend. I never realized that either. Now, the other way this movie was supposed to be like Iron Man was that it was supposed to launch a cinematic universe. The director of the movie, Martin Campbell, confirmed in 2010 that there were plans for a Green Lantern trilogy and plans for a wider DC film series. Warner Brothers even had a script commissioned for a sequel, but due to poor reviews, shortly after the release of the movie, plans for the sequels were scrapped. Green Lantern scored a 25% on Rotten Tomatoes along with a 45% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored a 5.5 out of 10. The movie did end up grossing $237 million at the box office on a budget of $200 million. So this movie was disappointing enough that Warner Brothers canceled future plans. Since this movie has been released, Ryan Reynolds has gone on to slam the movie at every chance he gets. He even famously made fun of the movie during the post-credit scene of Deadpool 2. What I find even more interesting is that 14 years later, the Green Lantern has yet to recover on the big screen. There have been plans of bringing Green Lantern back, but we have yet to see it. I wonder if the failure of this movie scared off the DCEU from introducing the character. When Justice League came out in 2017, it featured each of the prominent members of the Justice League except for the Green Lantern. There was a planned Green Lantern movie that was going to be in the DCEU, but after the failure of Justice League, that movie was never made. In 2020, a Green Lantern TV show was announced on HBO Max, but that project never saw the light of day either. Next year, we are supposed to be getting a Lanterns TV show that will be a part of James Gunn's new DCU. That would mean it took 15 years for the Green Lantern to lead his own live-action project again. Sure, we saw variations of the Green Lantern in Zack Snyder's Justice League and in the new Superman movie, but this new show will be the first time the Green Lantern leads his own project. The Green Lantern movie was a disaster. It set the character back 15 years, and the movie has only been mocked since. Let's switch up to Marvel and look at the next failed franchise. Number 2, the Sonyverse. Not including the Spider-Man films, the Sonyverse consisted of 6 movies: the Venom trilogy, Morbius, Madame Web, and Kraven the Hunter. I would not consider the Venom films to be failures. They are fine. They did okay at the box office. Fans don't hate them. But the other 3 movies, this is a generational run of terrible films. The first one was Morbius in 2022, starring everyone's favorite actor, Jared Leto. I don't know why big franchises keep signing Jared Leto to star in their movies. This dude is a freak, and supposedly he has his own cult too. Morbius scored a 15% on Rotten Tomatoes. The film was memed so hard that it did manage to get a 71% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored a 5.1 out of 10. Morbius would end up grossing $167 million at the box office on a budget of $75 million. Morbius back in 2022 famously reached the "it's so bad it's good" moniker for a movie. I'm not sure I would agree with that. I just find the movie to be lazy, cringy, and boring. Things got so bad for Morbius that it became the center of meme culture and shitposting. I remember the famous picture that the movie grossed like trillions of dollars, but of course the biggest meme from the movie was "it's Morbin time." Morbius was actually re-released in theaters because Sony thought they could capitalize on the memes, but in an entire weekend it failed to even make $500,000. So it's arguable Morbius was the first movie to ever bomb twice at the box office. Jared Leto had hopes of returning for the character. He even jokingly posted a fake script of Morbius 2, but the character never returned and likely never will return. The next movie in the Sonyverse was Madame Web, which also famously reached the point of being so bad it's good. Now, unlike Morbius, I actually saw this movie in theaters, and I agree the movie is so bad it's good. I remember vividly laughing at a handful of these scenes, and not in a good way. Something about Dakota Johnson in this movie makes her seem like such a terrible actress. The villain of this movie was also laughably bad. I laughed at like every line of dialogue of his. The best part of this movie is that we got to see Sydney Sweeney in a schoolgirl outfit. Madame Web scored a 10% on Rotten Tomatoes along with a 53% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored a 4.1 out of 10. The movie would end up grossing $100 million on a budget of around $100 million. So financially, this movie was even more of a failure than Morbius. There were reports that Sony had plans for more Madame Web films, but because the movie did so poorly, those plans were obviously scrapped. Honestly, it was likely this movie that led to Sony canceling all non-Spider-Man related projects. But there would still be one more movie to come out, and that would be Kraven the Hunter. I'll be honest, I never saw this movie, but I didn't hear great things. The movie scored a 15% on Rotten Tomatoes along with a 72% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored a 5.5 out of 10. The movie would end up grossing just $62 million on a budget of $110 million. So this movie was even more of a financial failure than the first 2 films. The Sonyverse really had a generational run of flops. Morbius, Madame Web, and Kraven the Hunter lost Sony so much money. So it's definitely fair to call these films in the Sonyverse part of a failed franchise. I want to stick with Sony for a second because there's another failed franchise we need to talk about with Sony. Number 3, the Amazing Spider-Man films. Now, these films are the first films on this list that aren't universally disliked. The Amazing Spider-Man duology has its fair share of fans, and I think that's mostly because of the portrayal of Peter Parker by Andrew Garfield. Spider-Man fans love Garfield as Spider-Man, and I can see why. For one, Garfield is such a great guy, and 2, he does make his version of Peter very likable, and it's different from the portrayal that Tobey gave in his movies. I think where these movies struggle is that the scripts aren't very engaging. While I like Peter and his relationship to Gwen, I find the plots of both movies to be lackluster, and the villains even more so. Now, we gotta keep this in mind. This video isn't about bad superhero movies. It's about franchises that failed. And whether you love these movies or not, the Spider-Man universe Sony had planned was scrapped. Therefore, it's fair to say this was a failed franchise. The first movie actually did alright. It scored a 71% on Rotten Tomatoes along with a 77% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored a 6.9 out of 10. The movie grossed $757 million on a budget of $230 million, so it was without question a successful movie. But the failure of this franchise can't be put on this movie. It's really the fault of the second movie. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 scored a 50% on Rotten Tomatoes, along with a 64% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored a 6.6 out of 10, so overall lower scores than the first movie. The movie grossed $708 million on a budget of $230 million. So while The Amazing Spider-Man 2 wasn't a box office failure by any means, I think it still underperformed compared to Sony's expectations. For one, this movie made less money than its predecessor. Also, Sony probably hoped these movies would out-earn the Raimi films, but they didn't. Before the release of The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Sony had plans to launch a cinematic universe around Spider-Man. In 2013, An Amazing Spider-Man 3 was announced for a 2016 release date, and there were even plans for a fourth movie in 2018. There were also plans for spin-off films, like the reported Sinister Six film, a Venom film, and a female-led film starring a resurrected Gwen Stacy. But because of the mixed reviews and the box office performance of The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Sony put those plans on hold. In 2015, an agreement was made between Sony and Marvel to have Spider-Man appear in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and once that happened, the character was recast with Tom Holland, and there was no more use for Garfield Spider-Man. The universe was officially cancelled. Andrew Garfield was left devastated by the news. He gave the character his all, and his films were panned and cancelled. Now, despite never getting An Amazing Spider-Man 3, Garfield did return in Spider-Man No Way Home to give the character some closure, and fans were happy to see him in the role again. But despite fans loving Garfield and wishing for a third movie, there are currently no plans to continue the franchise. Therefore, it's fair to call this a failed franchise. Let's now move back to DC so we can discuss one of my most hated films ever made. Number 4, Black Adam. I hate this movie so much. It's on my Mount Rushmore of my most hated movies I've ever seen. First and foremost, I don't like Dwayne Johnson. He just gives me the vibes of a businessman more than an actor. Like he only makes projects so it can help his brand. Now this might be changing with one of his newer movies, but my opinion needs more evidence to be changed. Also, this movie was so over the top and so ridiculous that I couldn't help but be shocked at some of the things that ended up happening. Now my thoughts on this movie don't really matter, because I think this is one of the few examples of a franchise failing because of factors outside of the actual film. Sure, the movie didn't get great reviews, and yes, I hate the movie with a passion, but Black Adam was not universally panned. It's not in the conversation with Batman and Robin or the Green Lantern. The movie did score an abysmal 39% on Rotten Tomatoes, along with a much better 87% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored a 6.2 out of 10. Now, Black Adam only grossed $393 million on a budget of around $230 million. So yes, the movie didn't do great at the box office. So then why did the franchise fail? When I say the franchise, I don't mean the entire DCEU. We know why that failed. What I do mean is the direction and the future of Black Adam specifically. There's no other way to say this. The reason Black Adam failed was because Dwayne Johnson attempted a coup of the DC franchise, and he failed. Dwayne Johnson was announced to play Black Adam all the way back in 2014. In the 8 years before the release of the movie, Johnson had stated over and over again how important he would be to the future of the franchise. In 2021, after the release of the Snyder Cut, Johnson repeatedly said at some point Black Adam would fight Henry Cavill's Superman. Seeing the popularity of the Snyder Cut, and Johnson being the opportunist that he is, he knew bringing back Cavill would be popular with the fans. He supposedly brought Cavill onto film that Black Adam post-credit scene without Warner Brothers' permission. During the marketing of the movie, Johnson would say things like, "The status quo of the DCEU has changed forever." He also said Black Adam would serve as the first film in phase 1 of a new storytelling initiative in the DCEU. But James Gunn, only a month later, was brought on to be the new president of DC Studios, and because he wanted to reboot the entire DC franchise, franchise, Black Adam and all its future plans were cancelled. There's a universe where Dwayne Johnson just makes a Black Adam movie and moves on with his life. But because he tried to take over DC and centered the entire franchise's future around him, it's fair to call Black Adam a failed franchise. Let's stay within DC and talk about a film that came out only a few months after Black Adam. But before continuing on with the rest of this video, only 14.3% of viewers are subscribed to this channel. So if you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Thank you. Number 5. The Flash. Now this movie really surprised me because I thought it was gonna be terrible, but I actually liked it. I thought the story was powerful and the heavy-hitting moments at the end really hit hard for me. I've always somewhat liked Ezra Miller's interpretation of the Flash, and the supporting characters in the movie were pretty solid as well. So to my surprise, I was shocked that this movie got middling reviews. The Flash scored a 63% on Rotten Tomatoes along with an 81% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored a 6.6 out of 10. Now, The Flash only grossed $271 million at the box office on a budget of around $220 million. So this movie was without question a financial failure. But even then, that's not why this movie is on this list. It's fair to say The Flash and the franchise it was supposed to set up failed before the movie even came out. As we just mentioned, James Gunn became the president of DC Studios in November of 2022. In January of 2023, Gunn announced the reboot of the DC universe. Then this movie came out 5 months later in June, so the movie never had a chance. But in order to understand why this movie is considered a part of a failed franchise, you need to understand what went on behind the scenes. DC had been a mess for years up until this point. There was no direction for the franchise. The Flash was set up as a movie that was going to reset the DCEU. The ending of the film was supposed to feature Barry walking out and seeing Sasha Cal's Supergirl, Michael Keaton's Batman, Henry Cavill's Superman, and Gal Gadot's Wonder Woman. These characters would be the future of the franchise, and it would culminate in the Crisis on Infinite Earth storyline. Reports confirm scenes with these characters were actually filmed at the end. So what happened? Well, a part of it was, of course, James Gunn rebooting the franchise. After the debacle of the Black Adam post-credit scene, James Gunn didn't want these dead-end movies setting up future stories that would never happen. So instead of leaving the scenes in, he decided to have it changed to feature George Clooney's Bruce Wayne instead. This was just a fun cameo instead of setting up the future of DC. So the franchise The Flash was setting up was dead on arrival. But even if Gunn never showed up and these scenes with all these other characters were kept in, the future of The Flash was uncertain. Ezra Miller had been a PR disaster for DC. He had been in the center of many controversial incidents and was even arrested. Warner Brothers considered scrapping the movie or trying to recast the character, but that would be way too costly financially, therefore they just decided to ride it out with Ezra Miller. As of this moment, there are no plans to bring back Ezra Miller as the Flash in any way. The Flash is definitely one of the more unique entries on this list, but it is still fair to call this a failed franchise. Let's now move on to the first movie on this list that's not a part of DC or Marvel. Number 6. Bloodshot. Now, if you have never heard of this movie, I don't blame you because neither did I until researching this video. Bloodshot was a 2020 superhero movie based on the comic character from Valiant Comics. The movie is about a soldier who was killed and then subsequently revived with nanotechnology. After his revival, he gained superhuman powers. Now, the movie did pretty poorly critically. The movie scored a 32% on Rotten Tomatoes along with a 78% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored a 5.7 out of 10. The movie only grossed $39 million at the box office on a budget of $45 million. Now you may think, wow, this movie must have been really bad to only make $40 million on that kind of budget. But that's not really fair. This movie was released on March 13th, 2020. Literally that same weekend COVID hit and lockdowns began. So this movie never even had a chance to gain word of mouth. If COVID never happened, maybe things plan out differently. Regardless of its eventual performance, there were plans for this movie to launch a shared cinematic universe. Apparently there were going to be 2 films based on the character Harbinger, and then there would be a crossover event titled Harbinger Wars. Apparently there were some concerns about this considering Sony made Bloodshot and Paramount owned the rights to Harbinger, but as of right now, that is the least of this universe's problems. What's really strange about this entry of my failed franchises list is that the jury is technically still out on this one. A Bloodshot 2 has been announced with Vin Diesel returning. We just haven't gotten any updates on it at all in the many years since it's been announced. So we'll just have to wait and see, but as of right now, I think it's fair to call this a failed franchise. Let's move back to Marvel so we can discuss what I think is one of the most underrated Marvel movies. Number 7, The Eternals. This is maybe the most underrated MCU movie, and also the only MCU movie to make the list. I was shocked that at the time, this was the lowest rated MCU movie of them all. I can't remember the last time I disagreed with critics more than I did with this movie. The Eternals scored a 47% on Rotten Tomatoes, along with a 77% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored a 6.2 out of 10. The Eternals grossed $402 million on a budget of $236 million. Firstly, I think this is one of the more beautiful Marvel movies. Marvel has been known for quite a long time for being visually inept. Like, the graphics used to look good, but there was nothing creative with the cinematography. This movie is gorgeous to watch. And sue me, movies are a visual medium and I like it when they look good. The other part of this movie that I really dug was the moral complexity behind its main dilemma. The movie, in a science fiction way, tackles the circle of life almost. Earth needs to be destroyed so Celestials can go on to create new worlds with new civilizations. For someone such as an Eternal, I can understand how that would be a complicated dilemma. Sure, not every character is the most fleshed out person in the world, but I thought the main characters were fleshed out nicely. I'm sure almost all of you will disagree with me, and that's cool. What we can all agree on is that Marvel seems to have no interest in continuing the stories of these characters. This movie came out in 2021, and there has not been a single character from this movie who has returned in something else. For a while, there was nothing about this movie that showed up anywhere else. I found it jarring that this movie ended with the head of a giant alien popping out in the ocean, and it took 3.5 years until it was shown in Captain America 4. I think that says a lot about how directionless this phase of Marvel was. Now, unlike the previous entries on this list, there were never any confirmed sequels, but Marvel doesn't make an MCU movie with an Oscar-winning director like Chloe Zhao and doesn't expect to continue the franchise in some way. Kumail Nanjiani said in a podcast that he did sign on a contract to appear in multiple films, so that should be evidence enough that this was supposed to be a planned franchise. Why did the MCU decide not to explore any more of the Eternals? Well, it's really simple. Most people didn't like the movie and it didn't make a lot of money. $402 million is not great for a movie with this kind of budget. So I guess Feige saw what worked and what didn't work and decided to toss aside the Eternals. Let's stay within Marvel so we can discuss a truly awful comic book movie. Number 8, Fantastic. I recently did a video on this movie, so it's fresh in my mind, and it is without question a terrible movie. Part of what made this movie so bad was that it was completely robbed of any joy or life. This is the Fantastic Four if everything exciting about the franchise was sucked out of it. Say what you will about the new Fantastic Four, but at least the characters seem to like each other in that movie. This movie is filled with people who often seem like they hate each other. 2015 was the time where every superhero movie had to be as realistic as possible. Josh Trank took that and decided to make the Fantastic Four into a body horror movie. The plot of this movie was a mess. The script was a mess. It was all plot, no story. I love that the fans continue to refer to this movie as Fantastic. Yes, that's what it said on the official poster, but it just feels so degrading. Like this movie doesn't deserve to be called Fantastic Four. I think it's fitting. The posters for this movie also show all of the characters fighting in a destroyed city when that doesn't even remotely happen in the movie. That always crossed my mind. The movie scored a 9% on Rotten Tomatoes along with an 18% audience score. To get less than a 10% is seriously impressive. On IMDb, the movie scored a 4.3 out of 10. The movie grossed an abysmal $167 million on a budget of $120 million. Right when this movie came out, there were plans for a sequel set to release in 2017. Simon Kinberg, the man who did most of the rewrites for Fantastic, was brought on to do a sequel. While the actor for Doctor Doom said he had no interest in returning returning to the franchise, Miles Teller and Kate Mara said they would be happy to return. In the months following the release of Fant4stic, the sequel was removed from Fox's slate of movies, and that would be the end of the Fant4stic universe. This movie was so bad that none of the characters would even show up in any of the multiverse movies like Deadpool and Wolverine. This year, the new Fantastic Four movie was released, and it featured an entirely new cast to play Marvel's first family. So as of right now, it seems like the story of Fant4stic won't continue in any way. I don't know which movie is worse, this or Green Lantern. A movie like Madame Web is so funny you can laugh at it, but not Fant4stic. This movie is soulless. Let's move on to the final movie on this list. Number 9, Suicide Squad. 2016 Suicide Squad is known as one of the worst movies in the DCEU, and that was always such a shame to me. I remember seeing this movie when it first came out in theaters, and I really liked it. You know, I was a kid, I didn't look into movies too critically, so I ended up really enjoying it. Watching it more recently, you can see why so many people dislike the movie. The script is such a mess. The movie introduces so many characters and only manages to develop them through exposition. The opening of this movie is so offensive to anyone who seriously cares about character development. I think I might like this movie slightly more than most people just because I think parts of the movie are entertaining. Margot Robbie simply kills it as Harley Quinn, and I liked Will Smith in the movie as well. So while this movie was certainly a mess, I can find some parts of it to enjoy. Suicide Squad scored a 26% on Rotten Tomatoes along with a 58% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored a 5.9 out of 10. The movie grossed $749 million at the box office on a budget of $170 million, so the movie was without question a financial success. So why does it belong on this failed franchise list, and what happened to the franchise? Well, it's certainly important to note that Suicide Squad was riddled with studio interference. For some reason, Warner Brothers meddled with this movie so much and completely changed David Ayer's vision. As a result, they got a mess of a movie that killed almost all of the future for the franchise. There are two reasons why I would consider Suicide Squad such a failure. The first is that there were a bunch of planned spin-offs for this movie, and none of them but one came out. There was supposed to be a Gotham City Sirens movie directed by David Ayer himself, Will Smith's Deadshot was supposed to get his own spin-off movie, and Harley Quinn was going to get her own spin-off movie as well. We did end up getting Birds of Prey in 2020, but that feels less like a Harley Quinn movie and more like a team-up movie with Harley Quinn as the main character. And the other reason I would consider Suicide Squad a failed franchise is because of the Suicide Squad in 2021. You may say, Goldman, we ended up getting James Gunn's Suicide Squad, so how can you call this a failure? Well, the Suicide Squad is not really a sequel to Suicide Squad, it's more like a reboot. 2 weeks ago I made a video on James Gunn's career, and in that video I discuss how when Warner Brothers approached Gunn to make the Suicide Squad, they allowed him to do anything he wanted as long as Harley Quinn was in the movie. So I think it's fair to say Warner Brothers made this movie to try and cleanse audiences from the first Suicide Squad, and because of that it's totally fair to call it a failed franchise. Now Suicide Squad has an interesting legacy. After the release of Zack Snyder's Justice League, fans demanded that we also get David Ayer's Suicide Squad, especially since Ayer said not much work is required to complete his version of the film. As of today, there are no plans to release David Ayer's Suicide Squad. Next year, for the 10-year anniversary, I expect fans to rally together to try and release the Ayer cut, but I wouldn't be too optimistic. The legacy of this movie is without question the studio interference. Ayer has gone on to disavow the film since the final product is nothing like he envisioned. So those are the 9 superhero failed franchises and what happened to them. Do you like some of these movies? Do you hate them all? Let me know down below. Thank you everyone so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to knight the Claude Squad, and I'll see you guys next time.